So, so my name's Tim. I'm an addict. I'm an alcoholic, member of Al-Anon, all sorts of other things too. And I see there are again people from all over the place, so that people are adequately greeted. I'm going to say Tov, guten Abend, gut Quell, dobry wieczór, buenas tardes, and good evening to the rest of you. If I've missed any languages out, then I'm sure you'll let me know. Now, we've got a rather difficult topic uh, this evening, which is the so-called God question. So the title of this evening, I've given it the title Atheism, Agnosticism and Belief. Now, it's a bit of a poison chalice as a topic because, as you'll be aware, whether or not there is anything beyond the material, what lies beyond the material, if anything does lie beyond it, who lives there, is there a God, what's the nature of God? These are big questions, and people have been talking about them and thinking about them and arguing about them, unfortunately, for thousands of years. Now, Bill does an absolutely terrific job in the chapter in the big book, We Agnostics, to really cover pretty much all of the bases of the debate over the centuries. And I've just got an hour. One would need a lot more than an hour to go into everything covered in the chapter. So what I'm going to try to do is to give something of a story arc, as it were, that goes from the beginning of the chapter to the end. And where it starts us off is a summary of, well, why we're even here in the first place. So page 44 on the laser display screen. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if, when drinking, or taking drugs, or whatever, you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. In other words, if you keep doing it, and when you do it, you do too much, boom, alcoholic addict. It says, if that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, we'll come on to what a spiritual experience is presently. Keith is saying the audio is choppy. Are people okay with the audio as it is, or is it? It is okay. Asking Leon. Leon, can you hear the words though? Okay, so I'll go slowly just in case. Hopefully, this won't be problematic. It may be the Zoom room. Now, to have a spiritual experience, we'll come on to what happens in it later on. But to have it, we must do something. And that's beautifully described in Bill's story. Next, we decided that hereafter, in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. Here's the principal, we're his agents. Here's the father, and we're his children. So the difficulty here is, although Bill says, a spiritual experience, that sounds soft, that sounds fluffy, it sounds very malleable to whatever one believes. The small print is different. We're to enter into some kind of working relationship with something we're going to call God. Now, that seems terribly improbable, but also it doesn't seem as though it's going to solve the problem of alcoholism. Let's see what happens according to the book if you do have the spiritual experience. We have not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. We are neither cocky nor are we afraid. That is our experience. That is how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition. In other words, if we have the spiritual experience, what's going to happen is the mental obsession, the impulse, the overpowering impulse to have a drink is not going to convert to an action. We might still want to drink, but the thought will sit there and we're going to stay sober. Now, although that connection seems odd, why should it be? A spiritual experience results in that safety from alcohol? Well, that's a bigger question. That's beyond the book, in fact. All we do is observe that that's exactly what happens to so many people in AA. We begin to trust it. Now, I'm just going to try an experiment with the microphone, and I'm going to try switching to the headphones. How's the sound now, Keith? Okay, we'll stick with that then. Hopefully that will work better. So the problem we've got is we're going to die of alcoholism unless we establish a relationship with God. This is problematic for most of us. And in fact, the big book tackles this head on with this following quotation from 44. To one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. Now, before we do more in the book, we need to talk a little bit about atheism and agnosticism and what they are. And now, even that could be a talk for an hour, but to put it very simply, the atheist, according to Bill in his other writings, says, definitely no God. I am absolutely sure, I've concluded that there is no God. The agnostic either says a fuzzy I don't know one way or the other, or says it can't be proved one way or the other, not even a debate to be had. Now, if one comes to the question of step 2, the question of step 2 really breaks down into this. Is the universe just atoms? Or is there more than that? Is there consciousness? Is there a realm of the metaphysical which is separate beyond the physical? Question number 1. Question number 2. In that other realm, is there a being of great power? Question number 3. Can that power help me? Now, if one starts off by saying, let's say, I grew up with an idea of God which was a sort of watered down Church of England idea of God, i.e. barely an idea at all. If one comes to the question presupposing a particular idea of God, you've already drawn a conclusion before you've started the investigation. So if someone comes to this question of step 2 and they are an agnostic or an atheist, one says, I was entirely atheist. One says, well, you've drawn a conclusion based on evidence. I had drawn a conclusion based on the evidence I could see. I had lots of arguments. All that is being asked of me in this process is to say, is it possible that you hadn't gathered all of the evidence there is about this metaphysical realm? Is it possible you've missed something? And honestly, I had to concede that to be the case. Secondly, have I read everything there is to read on the subject of whether or not there is God? Whether or not there is a metaphysical realm? The truth is, I had only read atheists on the subject. I'd never read people who believed in God. I certainly wasn't giving both sides of the argument a fair reading. And although history is littered with perfectly respectable atheists, it's also littered with perfectly respectable believers who are scientists, who were intelligent, who were thoughtful, who'd thought about this far longer than I had at the tender age of 21 when I got sober. I'm mid-50s now. There's a case to answer. It cannot simply be dismissed because I've seen something funny on Channel 4 and I've watched a couple of YouTube videos. It has to be more than that. It's a serious question. But also, there's a fundamental flaw let's say there is a realm of the physical, and then somewhere, or accessible through my consciousness, there is an entirely different metaphysical realm. It's no good looking in the material for evidence of the metaphysical, at least not conclusive evidence. If you're in the living room and you're wondering what's going on in the kitchen, however much you examine the evidence in the living room, you'll only get a scant idea of what is going on in the kitchen. There might be a smell coming from there, and you might infer that someone is cooking some tofu or something. I don't know, whatever. C.S. Lewis says about the examination of the question of God, reason alone won't tell you whether the cat is in the linen cupboard. Unfortunately, you have to go into the linen cupboard and see if the cat is in there. Reason will operate only on the evidence given to it in the material realm. Unfortunately, the only way to find out for sure is to take a trip to the realm of the metaphysical, and if you manage to get there, well, that's proof. But the nature of it is it necessarily lies beyond the material. Hence the absurdity of Gagarin, the Russian cosmonaut who got out into space and said, I don't see God up here, as though he's more likely to be out in space than he is maybe a couple of miles north of Milton Keynes. One place should be as good as another. I was looking in the wrong place. And also, the other thing, I had a vested interest in not believing in God. Because if God existed, there might be obligations. It might change everything. I would not be a reliable witness. My reason alone was insufficient to make me a reliable witness because I had skin in the game. I had an investment in there not being a God. The other thing which is wise to remember, if you want to prove that there is a mouse in the attic, there are mice in the attic, all you need to do is find a single dropping and you know that there are mice. If you want to prove there are no mice in the attic, you've got to have a full-scale expedition and scour every corner. So the believer, unfortunately, has a significant tactical advantage here. The atheist has got quite a job to prove that there is definitely no metaphysical realm, and if there is one, there is no one in it, and if there is someone in it, that someone cannot help anyone. Impossible to prove a negative conclusively. Now, one must always people respected my atheism. They said, you've gathered some evidence, you've constructed some arguments, fine. We have no desire to dislodge those at all. At least not the evidence, not the arguments. But might you put your conclusion on the shelf and for a while start gathering more evidence and drawing conclusions based on the enlarged body of evidence? And I could do that. If I'm a scientist, if I'm of scientific bent, then I should be able to do that with no problem at all. And there are some very good quotations to illustrate these points. Bill saying, I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. And that was my bias. If there was a God, something in me instinctively knew that God would pull rank over me. Secondly, we agnostics and atheists chose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and end of it all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? And then the following one, neither is reason, as most of us use it, entirely dependable, though it emanate from our best minds. I'd been wrong about many things. Even in my arrogance at the age of 21, I could recognise I'd been wrong about many things. If there was a possibility I was wrong on the question of God, then it was worth a further investigation of the matter, especially considering that my life was on the line at this point. Now, the first little trick, and it's not really a trick, it's simply unwinding one of the problems. If you're trying to investigate this whole metaphysical question, if you start with a fixed concept of God, you're doing something which in logic is called begging the question, baking some conclusion into how you're presenting the question in the first place. So rather than saying God, the book is brilliant. It says, let's put that on one side. Let's say a power greater than ourselves. So we're getting rid of all of the associations, all of the specific ideas associated with the word God that maybe one has been brought up with. Now, the reason why this is so brilliant is because it speaks directly to the problem that we're faced with. So the problem that I'm to solve is the impulse to drink comes at me and it tries to overpower me and impel me to drink. And I need power to resist that. But on my own, I do not have sufficient power. How do I know? Because I kept failing to resist it. And so if my problem is lack of power, clearly if the problem is going to be solved, I need a power greater than the power that I have. So the only little bit of God we need to be worried about is not the question people always talk about, parasites that burrow through the eyes and cancer and death and the dinosaurs and all sorts of things. Let's not start there. Let's leave that until later and look at this simple question of power. When you get to your 50s and you're reading a book at 11 o'clock at night, you'll discover you need more light than you used to read the book than 10 years ago. Lack of power is the dilemma. If you don't have enough of something, you need more of something. You need a greater something, hence the need for a power greater than myself. Now, we don't even need a traditional concept of God. We need the commodity of power to resist a drink. Where that power comes from is a question that can be left aside. Few of us enough, I imagine, have a sound enough understanding of physics to understand where the electricity really comes from to boil the kettle. But you do know that when you flick the switch, the kettle comes on. What we're interested in is the commodity that we can access, the commodity of power. Now, the first question, there are a couple of questions that the book asks. The first one is essentially, does a power greater than me exist? And it says this, do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? Now, this is a question not about will God do something for me or something like that, but very simply, does it exist? You can believe that something exists without worrying about what it can do for you. Simply, do I believe that it exists is a different question than do I believe in it. A friend of mine says, you can believe that the Conservative Party exists without believing in the Conservative Party. These are two fundamentally different questions. So it breaks it down. It starts with this question of existence. And this is where I think this is a genius move in the book. It starts off by saying, well, it exists for others. And here's the quotation. On one proposition, however, these men and women are strikingly agreed. Every one of them has gained access to and believes in a power greater than himself. This power has in each case accomplished the miraculous, the humanly impossible. And, well, what is the humanly impossible thing? Seemingly he could not drink even if he would, even if he wanted to. So I go to AA and I found that Nigel has discovered and gained access to a power greater than Nigel. Sally has found a power greater than Sally. Olive has found a power greater than Olive. Now, it looks right now as though each one has their own little guardian angels, their own little powers that have saved them. But The question is, the power that saved Nigel, the power that saved Olive, the power that saved Sally, who's greater, me or that power? If you've ever tried saving a friend in AA and you can't, and then they have a spiritual awakening and they discover that they're staying sober, in head-to-head combat, in a simple test, who can keep Olive sober? The power that keeps Olive sober is certainly more powerful than I am. So simply by observing other people in AA, there is a power greater than them, and that power is greater than me because it's doing something I can't do. So whether I like it or not, the mere fact that Olive is sober proves there is a power greater not just than Olive, but greater than me. We're 98% of the way towards believing in God. There are a few more little twizzles. Now the question is, one might legitimately ask, well, maybe it is simply a case of little guardian angels, little quirks of the universe, that Marjorie and Rupert and all of these other people have got their own little higher powers, but unfortunately it's a little bit of a cosmic lottery. Some people have got one, some people haven't. But when you look around AA, you notice a couple of things. First of all, the universal fact that people who thoroughly do what AA suggests, including all of the prayer and meditation and so on, they just don't drink. Now, they might come to drink in the future if they slacken off for long enough, but it simply seems to work for anyone. As Agatha Christie said about her novels, another sausage from the sausage machine. So the miracle of AA, of CA, is a wholesale miracle. Everyone's miracle essentially looks pretty much the same. There are going to be details which are different, but in each case, the power enables them to resist the impulse to do whatever it is when it arises, whether it's drink or drugs or something else. But also, the universality is this. The power seems to be activated, not randomly, not like a great finger coming down from the sky, but in direct response as a direct consequence of taking certain actions. So we've identified a mechanism which enables anyone who activates the mechanism to get sober and stay sober. Now, the reason that proves this is universal is whether or not people get well lies in their hands, not whether they're lucky beneficiaries of the cosmic lottery. You take the actions, you'll get well. You don't take the actions, you won't get well. As Clancy says, the steps don't care why you take them. It is the taking of them which will bring about the results. And the basic approach that the chapter also takes is to get a little bit away from the theory of whether or not there is a God to the practical evidence. And what we're interested in is what works. And it's so simple. Just this one line at the end of the next quotation. Our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. I looked at the people round me who had a relationship with a higher power. They were doing better than me, and they were no fools. So whatever I was doing, even if I was 98% right intellectually, there was something fundamentally wrong, or I wouldn't have been in such trouble. Even if they were silly 98%, the 2% was getting them well and keeping them well. It's the results that matter, not the theory. Now, then we come to a second question. We're racing now. Page 53. We've now, to catch ourselves up, demonstrated that there is a power in the universe that can be accessed in a systematic way. The one remaining question is this: is that power available to me as well? And the line which expresses this is on page 53. God either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? Now, this is a binary choice. Either the power can keep me from having the first drink, or it can't. If it fails even once, that's curtains for me, so that might as well be an absolute failure. This is why one can't sit on the fence about this. One's got to make a decision, one way or another, what one is going to believe. Now, the reason this is a difficult question to answer, the quotation is this from 53. Some of us had already walked far over the bridge of reason toward the desired shore of faith. Perhaps we had been leaning too heavily on reason that last mile, and we did not like to lose our support. I want to make this very concrete. Everything so far has been about reason, observation, reasonable inference based on the observations one makes in AA. But then the question, might it work for me, is speculative. Why? Because it's about the future. So what is going to happen in the future? One can speculate reasonably, but one cannot have certainty. And faith is a little stopgap that helps you over that little uncertainty. It's just a small uncertainty, but it is there. And faith is that as soon as you know something for sure, you don't need faith anymore. Faith plugs the gap. Now, I said when I was new in AA, I can't believe things that aren't true. I'm not an idiot. I don't have the capacity for faith. I don't have the capacity to simply trust something without evidence. The book brilliantly turns the tables on us, page 54. It says, did we not have confidence in our ability to think? What was that but a sort of faith? Yes, we had been faithful, abjectly faithful to the God of reason. So, in one way or another, we discovered that faith had been involved all the time. Now, what that means to me practically is that all through my drinking, I had an increasing body of evidence that my decision making was rotten to the core. And yet I was perfectly able to continue trusting in it, even though all of the evidence was pointing in the other direction. Perfectly capable of faith. It then goes on to look at these other attributes of a relationship with God, worship and love. I think these are far less important to the argument, but they're there, so let's cover them. Had we not variously worshipped people, sentiment, things, money, and ourselves? And then, with a better motive, had we not worshipfully beheld the sunset, the sea, or a flower? Who of us had not loved something or someone? Now, it sort of tricks you, because it gets you to admit that, to prove that you're capable of love and worship. But then, absolute masterstroke. He's not a trained theologian, but he does this job better than anything I've ever come across, with the possible exception of C.S. Lewis. He says, how much did these feelings, these loves, these worships have to do with pure reason? Little or nothing, we saw at last. Were not these things the tissue out of which our lives were constructed? Did not these feelings, after all, determine the course of our existence? And when one looks at the things that one loves and appreciates, the people, the music, it doesn't make sense. You look at the people you absolutely adore, and you say, well, what virtues do they have that are not to a penny in half of the other people I know? And there's nothing there. You can't reason it. There is plenty of evidence, if one thinks about it, that purely from one's own experience, the universe is more than just atoms. We're more than just chemistry sets. There are areas of consciousness which lie beyond the mere synthetic nuts and bolts of the material world, and that those things are the really important things, not the synthetic nuts and bolts, not the prosaic steel girder. Now, there's a line which I read. It was, don't laugh, Christmas Eve, I think, somewhere around then, in 1993. So it was my first Christmas sober, and I was having a rotten time with my poor old long-suffering parents in the county of Dorset. And I thought, I know, I'll read the big book. I bet that'll help. And I picked up We Agnostics and I read this line. Could we still say that the whole thing was nothing but a mass of electrons created out of nothing, meaning nothing, whirling on to a destiny of nothingness? Now, Bill poses that question as if, well, of course no one is nihilistic. Of course we can't say life is pointless, and I could. I'd been saying it my whole life. Everything's pointless. I might as well die. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said that life is not worth it. It's too much of a bother to live. I mean, I think Sartre was very clever. He was quite right. And then Camus talking about pushing that stone up to the top of the hill like Sisyphus, and every day it rolls down and you have to push the stone back up. You say there's nothing in the universe, there's no point in anything. Well, that sounds about right to me. But here's the thing. That nihilistic view bothered me. If it was real, why would it bother me? It's because I sensed deep down that there ought to be a point to life, that life, the universe, the people in it ought to make sense, and I couldn't make sense of it, and I was frustrated. Now, if everything was just atoms, where on earth did my disturbance at the fact come from? Where did my notion that the universe would be better designed differently, where did that come from? Because the atoms won't tell you that. It was many years later I realised that the very fact that I was depressed at the idea that life was pointless was proof itself that life could not be pointless. Or where could I have got that idea from? And it turns out that's not the only one. There are several other things, several other phenomena of experience, which simply cannot come from the nuts and bolts of the material world. There is no morality in nature. Nature does not teach morality. It's very, very difficult to derive theories of why we have a sense of right and wrong simply from survival, because survival will tell you, the evolutionary theory that whatever promotes your survival, the ability to pass on your genes, is more likely to therefore result in those genes being propagated, and gradually other things are weeded out. Morality often seems quite at odds with the selfishness of the need to survive at the cost of other people. So the idea that nature produces morality, I don't think so. Now, the full argument, you'll have to read the philosophers who talk about this. Reason is another one. And again, I'm not going to rehearse, it would take an hour to run through it. But C.S. Lewis and lots of other people argue that reason cannot be explained by the material world, can't be explained by brain chemistry, can't be explained by evolution. C.S. Lewis is good on the question. A contemporary philosopher and also computer scientist called Bernardo Kastrup is excellent on this question of the fact that we're more than just chemistry sets, and he would say we're not even chemistry sets. We are consciousness. We are something beyond. Now, when I look at my experience, honestly, my sense that there are things beyond the material was there from day one, and that those things were more important than the material. The mere valuing of things beyond matter shows that matter is not all there is. So it turns out, once I've got the door cranked open just a tiny little bit, because I can see that there is a power that works for other people, which might work for me. And I realise I need a little bit of faith, the courage to take actions. Which actions? The actions of the steps, the courage to take those, to take the experiment conduct the experiment, as C.S. Lewis said, of going into the linen cupboard to see if the cat is in there, making a foray into the world of the spirit to see if there really is a God. I was willing to make the leap of faith, which is a leap of action. It's not blind faith, it's faith with my eyes wide open, taking full cognizance of all of the facts of the situation and recognizing that this isn't the first time. I have a good body of evidence that there is a realm which lies beyond the material. If you want an image for the relationship between the realm that lies beyond the material and here, and waking up into it, imagine you're an actor in Macbeth and you've forgotten that you're an actor. And so you're in Macbeth, you're struggling in this desperate drama. But then something happens and you start to remember, not find out for the first time, but start to remember that you're not Macduff, you're an actor who is playing Macduff. And that there is a theatre, and you're on a stage in a theatre, and that the food in the buffet bar in the interval is more real than the food on the table on the stage. And suddenly the drama of Macbeth, you're still playing your part, you're still feeling all of the feelings of Macduff, but you have this sense of safety now. You're no longer mortally threatened the way Macduff is mortally threatened, because you realise your existence lies outside the theatre, and when the play ends and it's the end of Macduff, it's not the end of you. That's what the waking up is. And I realised that all through the play, before I took step 2, there were eerie experiences when I sensed that there was something beyond the play in all sorts of different ways. Let's see where this leaves us. I'm going to miss out one of the quotations. What is this but a miracle of healing? Yet its elements are simple. Circumstances made him willing to believe. He humbly offered himself to his Maker, then he knew. About 3 or 4 weeks into my most recent bout of sobriety, which started in 1993, so this was in the August, I'd committed to the programme, but I was frankly still extremely sceptical about the God question. In chapel at school, I was a chorister. In chapel, I would sit there reading Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian, high enough that other people could see I was reading it during the sermon because I had better things to do. That's how obnoxious I was. But I got to this position 3 or 4 weeks in when I tried to get other human beings to talk me out of having a drink repeatedly, and they'd succeeded and succeeded and succeeded until they failed. Anything material, the more you use it, whether it's your fridge or Knicker elastic or whatever it is, the more you use it, the more it wears out. And I wore out the material help offered to me by other people in AA. And I realised that the one thing I hadn't done was go and try. Now, actually, I will read this little quotation. It is reason herself which teaches us not to rely on reason only in this matter. This is C.S. Lewis. For reason knows that she cannot work without materials. When it becomes clear that you cannot find out by reasoning whether the cat is in the linen cupboard, it is reason herself who whispers, "Go and look." This is not my job. It is a matter for the senses. Now, when looking for God, you don't look in the linen cupboard, you don't look under the bed, you don't even necessarily look in church. You've got to look inside. And we have the other quotation: we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. Now, we're told that the access point to God is internal rather than external. I think it's in the New Testament somewhere where the chap says, don't pray publicly, go inside the cupboard. There's another cupboard. Go inside the cupboard and shut the door and pray there. I'm gonna bring a third cupboard into it. So we've got the linen cupboard of C.S. Lewis. We've got the cupboard of the New Testament. There is a third cupboard which I'll come to, and the whole trick lies in the third cupboard. I had to go and look. Now, how do you contact God? Well, I knew a thing or two. Literally 2 things. That you were to pray to God, and God wouldn't necessarily answer with a loud voice. If you hear a loud voice, it might be something else. And I prayed, and as soon as I prayed, the desire to drink left me. And game over. In the question of, are there mice in the attic, I'd found my first mouse. The question was now solved in perpetuity. I can't go back on that. The other cupboard, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is well worth a 7th or an 8th read. If you haven't read it this year, read it this year. Because it's all about this. If you're familiar with the story, there's a house, and in the house is a room, and there's a wardrobe. And through the wardrobe, you can access this whole other world called Narnia. Under certain circumstances, you can access it. And when the 4 children get into Narnia for the first time together, they discover it's cold, it's winter there. Now, the wardrobe had had overcoats in it. And Peter, who's the oldest and therefore the sensible one, says, although Lucy is the most sensible of them all in a more real sense, he says, the coats, why not wear the coats? Now, we shouldn't really, because they don't belong to us. But we're not taking them out of the wardrobe. From the wardrobe's point of view, the whole country of Narnia, he says, is inside the wardrobe. That's Peter's mistake. He thinks Narnia is inside the wardrobe. When people say, my higher power, it's as though it's like an elf on the shelf, this little faculty you found inside you. Now, I think we're forgivable, we're excusable for believing that, because look at what the book says. We were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man is the fundamental idea of God. Not God, the idea of God. The access point is inside, but God is infinitely bigger. The realm outside the wardrobe of Narnia is bigger than the wardrobe. So Peter's got it backwards. The little world we live in, this tiny universe of materiality, is a fraction. 2 more images, and then I'll sum up, and then we can have some questions, so you can start popping questions in the chat. G.K. Chesterton, in possibly the book Orthodoxy, I didn't prepare this quotation, but he says something like this. He's having a go, as usual, at one of his intellectual contemporaries, and a materialist who thinks that the universe is purely physical and science will explain everything. And he says his purely material cosmos is too small, even for me, even for one human being. I can't fit my life experience inside his mechanical view of the universe. It's absolutely right. It's an extraordinary idea. Now I've forgotten the other quotation. Where does this leave us? It leaves us on page 60. That we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. In other words, when the impulse to drink comes, we'll obey it, and then we're out to lunch, potentially forever. That probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism, which includes an AA meeting. It'll work for a while. There'll come a day when it's not enough. That God could and would if he were sought. And what we're going to be looking at next week, I'll just give you the so-called heads up before we get on to the questions. They've already started to come in. Next week, we're going to look at the failure of self. Before we get on to step 3, we've got to look at the failure of self, and in particular, the failure of materialism. So that's another big topic, and it's all through the book, lots of different things from different chapters. Now, first question. Oh, so good. Is it a matter of letting God in or letting God out? Also, how do you know what's God's will when it might seem like the wrong choice? So those are two strikingly different questions. Let's look at the first one. Is it a matter of letting God in or letting God out? I think the problem lies in the frame, and by the way, do put your little virtual hands up as well if you have questions. I think the problem lies in the framing of the question, because what it presupposes is that, with the first part, is it a matter of letting God in, that God is absent? Now, if God weren't absent, then the question would go away. Now, letting God out, that implies the out that you're letting him into is also free of God. I think it's much better to start with the notion that God is everywhere. The metaphysical, I gave the image of the theatre and the play going on in the theatre. That's one way of looking at it. And of course, all the things going on in the play. So the playwright, his or her words, the direction of the director, the production of the producer, all of the actors, everything on the stage is all part of the real world. So the material world is all part of the realm of the spirit. Another image is, imagine a sponge, and now imagine the sponge is soaked in water. There is nowhere that the water isn't. The water suffuses the sponge. The realm of the spirit suffuses the entire universe, the entire physical universe. There's an idea in traditional Judaism that in every moment God causes the universe to cease to exist and then flushes it into existence every moment. So it's flashing in and out of existence. That's the relationship between the two realms. There is a theological idea which died a bit of a death, I think, in the 17th century, that God was like a watchmaker who made the universe and wound it up like a mechanical mechanism, and is sitting in his armchair reading the newspaper, waiting for the mechanism to wind down, and is not going to interfere or intervene. I don't think that's helpful. I think we do have a relationship. I certainly have a relationship with a power greater than myself, or I'm mad. It's one of the two. And I don't think I'm mad, although you may freely disagree with that. But the point, back to the question, the point is to start to communicate with that which is there the whole time and has always been there the whole time. The letting God in and out, once you say that about, well, God is there, our job is to learn to communicate, there is an aspect of that relationship which looks like letting in and looks like letting out. The letting in is simply, rather than asking the ego what to do in any situation, one's asking God what to do in the situation. And that, in a sense, is letting God reply when we ask, letting God provide strength when we ask. And that, so what we're letting in is the two things which come from God, which is knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Letting God out, as we do that, God will start to become manifest in our everyday lives. Next question. How does one forgive God for the loss of a child, a loved one, a war? Now, this question of essentially, it's a very old theological question, which is, why do bad things happen to good people? So our presumption is we're good people and bad things are happening, and if God is in charge, then he is causing all of this. Now, this is not just a single question, and it's not something that we've come up with, since Margaret Thatcher or something. It's much, much older than that, and is the technical term for this branch is a whole branch of theology called theodicy, D-I-C-I, theodicy. Now, I'm not going to solve theodicy in 5 minutes, but I'm going to say a few small things. There is a book by C.S. Lewis called The Problem of Pain, which covers this in remarkable depth. There is also a book by Rabbi Harold Kushner called something like When Bad Things Happen to Good People. If you search on that, you'll find it, even if that's not quite right. Oswald Chambers wrote a book on the book of Job, spelt Job, pronounced Job, in the Old Testament, which is all about this question. It's one of the earliest writings on this question. Alice Thomas Ellis wrote a very good book on this question, and lots of other people have covered the topic as well. So rather than trying to work it out in your living room, go and read all the people who've addressed this question. But there are a couple of things which can be said. As soon as you admit the existence of a metaphysical realm, and this material realm is only part of the show, then you won't find the explanation for what goes on here just here. You've got to take the whole thing into account. One of the big arguments which gets presented is, and I think this is a good one, you've essentially got a couple of things going on with the difficult things that happen in the world. The first is the stuff which is caused by human malevolence or negligence. Secondly, you've got the so-called natural things, so that the cancers and the diseases and so on. And these are two entirely separate questions. I don't want to say much more about either of those, but if you start to think along those two lines, to have free will means that it is possible for people to go against God's will. So we're not automata. If we lived in a universe of automata, the charge would stand. But since people, particularly with the people acting badly, unfortunately, if people have free will, and for us to have free will, everyone's got to have free will, and bad stuff is going to happen. That's 1/1000th of the answer, but that's part of the path which goes down there. Now let's look at some other questions. If God is everything, does that mean the idea of God is within everything, or he is literally everything? When the book says either God is everything or God is nothing, you've got to read it in the context. I don't think he's making some kind of ontological statement about God. He's not. His ambition, Bill's ambition on page 53, is much more modest. Either God can help everyone, or he's of no use to me. Either God is universally available, or God strikes like benevolent lightning occasionally? That's the real question. There is something that G.K. Chesterton said which is helpful with this. He, in another of his essays, I think it's in Heretics, where he takes issue, as usual, with someone, and he has a go, in a very good-natured way, but he has a go at a particular theological writer from the late 19th century who said that we're all one. All of us, you and me and everyone, we're all one. And he says the trouble is with that, if we are all one, where does that leave the question of love? For there to be love, there has to be an other. And that other has to be a genuine other. Otherwise, we're all simply this single self-loving lump of self-centeredness. Brilliant. I've never been comfortable with the we're all one thing. It sounds very spiritual and very nice. I'd never been comfortable with it. It was only when G.K. Chesterton said that I understood why. And one of the ideas that you get in theology is that God arguably perhaps created people so that there would be someone to love and someone who could love him back but wasn't obliged to. Therefore, if he were loved back, it would mean something. If it was all obvious, the game wouldn't be much of a game. What's your personal definition of God? Do you believe in Jesus? That's a question, isn't it? Let's look at the first one of those. What's your personal definition of God? I'm skeptical about trying to define God. There was an AA speaker I heard a long time ago who said something to the effect of, God obviously can't be understood, so don't even try, we don't know anything. And I don't think that's helpful. I think we can know a few things. A definition presupposes some sort of completeness. And I don't think one can be complete when trying to understand God. And Don Pritz is very good on this, the AA speaker. He says, this is why it's a conception, not a concept. It is an idea which is organic and which is allowed to grow over time. Some things that I do believe, personally, belief and conceptions are subject to change over time. There's a very good set of words someone gave me a while ago. That God is big, strong, clever, creative, caring, resourceful. Big, strong, clever, creative, caring, and resourceful. And that gives me a lot of room to move around. That gives me a lot to work with. The same person said God is also of above average intelligence. And he's not deaf, so you don't need to shout. And he's got a good memory, so you don't need to repeat yourself. And that saves a lot of time and effort. Relax. He really has got this. As far as the big book is concerned, because that is our chief concern, all the way through, it stresses the two commodities that we can get from God, the two resources, knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. It refers to these in different ways: inspiration, intuitive thought, decision, direction, power, strength. So the bit that we're interested in with God is the bit that we interact with. One thing on the question of how you accept bad things happening, including natural disasters, part of the answer to that If the purpose of life is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, then the universe is a pretty rotten universe to be living in. If, however, there is such a genuine thing as purpose and value, if you look at the great people over history, the great women and men that one admires, very few of them had cushy times. But you look at those lives and you say, even though they were very painful, they were hugely valuable. And I doubt if many of them, if you would ask people, I suppose one should ask people, would you exchange the extraordinary life you've had for one where you didn't achieve anything, but you were free of pain? I doubt very many would say yes. Now, once you reset the value of life to it being worthwhile, the question of duration of life, pain, suffering, misadventure, they change. They change fundamentally. So a lot of the question will go away as oneself changes over time. As to whether or not I believe in Jesus, that's outside the scope of this talk. Someone asks, if we have free will, does that mean we can take our will back? The best way, if I can try and explain how I look at this question. The faculty of free will is there innate in all of us. The question is what we do with it. Now, I believe in that when I took step 3, I didn't complete something, I started something. And I don't think that process of starting to turn one's will and life over to God, once that's really sincerely started, I don't think the process can be reversed. I think if one relapses and stays relapsed, maybe one's back entirely at square one. But over the last 32 years, even when I've gone very off track, that fundamental upward trajectory and path has not been altered. I think the decision was a permanent and final one. It was a permanent and final decision to embark on a journey. Now, on certain parts of the journey, I've strayed a long way off the path, but the path was there in a way that it hadn't been before I made the decision. Before step 3, there was no path to stray from. I was simply wandering around completely lost. I take step 3, there is now a path. The question is, am I on the path, or am I not on the path? Am I going towards the path or away from the path? The faster you go away from the path, the faster you can come back. The question is not one of, is my will with me or is my will with God? It's which there are 2 radio stations, the ego and God. Which one am I tuned into right now? If I'm tuned into God, I'm good. If I'm tuned into the ego, it's bad. Very simple. And over time, I'm tuned into the God radio more often. Now, there's often radio interference, and what I think I'm hearing is not what is being broadcast. But that's a different question. Someone had a question about how do you know it's God's will. That's a big topic for step 11. We might even do a whole session on how do you know if it's God's will. But basically this. Number 1, if it's constructive and about doing good in the world, it may well be God's will. If it's to do a duty which has already been revealed to me, it's probably God's will. If it doesn't involve fixing, changing, or controlling anyone else around me, but simply adjusting my own behaviour, it may well be God's will. If it's today, it may well be God's will. If there's any sense of anger or retaliation in it, it's not God's will. And the application of common sense, experience, knowledge, testing against the principles of the book, phone a friend. All of these things are tools, and the worst thing it can be is a terrible mistake. If it's a terrible mistake, admit it promptly. Someone said, if you have time, how do you deal with the newcomers who have had bad experiences with religious orders, find a new higher power? It's easier for a carpenter to take a fresh piece of wood and fashion it into a chair than to take a table and fashion it into a chair. In other words, not to try to process all of that historical stuff, but simply to start again. Put all of that stuff on the shelf and start with a blank sheet of paper, so-called tabula rasa, and build up and use the notion of borrowing someone else's higher power. That works very well. And to recognize that if people did wicked things, those were the people who were doing it, and their conception of God was also it's very rarely shared. Even if such people were members of an established religion, they were usually not representative of the religion as a whole. To see those as horrific anomalies one had the misfortune to encounter for a number of years. But they don't get... They can't bagsy God and say, well, we got there first in this person's experience, so we get to define this person's experience of God. Really, I'm going to swear, say F off to those people and their ideas, and they don't get to dictate whether I have an experience with God. That's none of their business. So off with them, and then start again. So someone says, asking yourself what spiritual expressions mean, and it says, do not let any prejudice you have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. Would you consider this as an exercise to take sponsees through as part of step 2? No. And I'll tell you why. In the step 2 position, if one needs to take step 2, one's pretty cooked. And to get the poor soul to try to figure something out on their own, to take terms and define terms, don't do that. Tell them what the book says, share some experience, and then say, do you want to take step 3 now? And take it from there. I think one can get too wrapped up in definitions and intellectual things. Let's see if there's anything else. When a sponsee states, no, I do not believe, and I'm not willing to believe in a power greater than myself, what do you do? Well, there are several points in the book where if you don't sign up to the idea, you can't go any further. And for instance, on the bottom of 2022, it talks about the experience of any alcoholic will abundantly prove that whenever he puts any alcohol whatsoever into his body, something happens both in the bodily and the mental sense which makes him virtually impossible to stop. If someone says, well, that doesn't happen to me, you got to stop on that. You can't go any further. If someone says they're not willing, okay, that's fine. If you are ever willing, give me a call back. We'll carry on the conversation. But you can't do anything. You can't do anything with someone who's made up their mind. As a newcomer 25 days in, what's my best course of action to being there for a friend who's relapsed? When my friends relapse, there's almost nothing I can do. Don't chide them or tell them off or tell them what to do. If you can stand to take a call, if I can stand to take a call, I take a call. But I might cap the amount of time. But they're not in my hands. There's almost nothing I can do. And let's see. I don't think there's any other questions. So thank you very much, and I'm going to stop there, Keith.